So first of all, thank you for that heated discussion about the present. I would love to go back into history in a way that informs what we can look for in by way of hope for the future. So when has in Israel and Palestine have we been closest to something like a peace settlement, to something that like where both sides would be happy and enable the flourishing of both peoples?
Well, from my knowledge of the 120 years or so of conflict, the closest I think the two sides have been to reaching some sort of settlement appears to have been in the year 2000, when Barack and then subsequently Clinton offered a two-state settlement to PLO, Palestinian Authority chairman Yasser Arafat. And Arafat seemed to waver. He didn't immediately reject what was being offered, but ultimately came down at the end of Camp David in July 2000. He came down against the proposals, and Clinton, who said he wouldn't blame him, later blamed Arafat for bringing down the summit and not reaching a solution there. But I think they're on the table, certainly in the Clinton parameters of December 2000, which followed the proposals by Barack in July. The Palestinians were offered the best deal they're ever going to get from Israel, unless Israel is destroyed, and then there'll just be a Palestinian Arab state. But the best deal that Israel could ever offer them, they were offered, which essentially was 95% of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, half of the old city of Jerusalem, some sort of joint control of the Temple Mount, and the Gaza Strip, of course, in full. And the Palestinians said no to this deal. And nobody really knows why Arafat said no. That is, some people think he was trying to hold out for slightly better terms. But my reading is that he was constitutionally, psychologically incapable of signing off on a two-state deal, meaning acceptance of the existence of a Jewish state. This was really the problem. And
of Israel or of a Jewish state?
Of a Jewish state, the Jewish state of Israel. He wasn't willing to share Palestine with the Jews and put his name to that. I think he just couldn't do it. That's my reading. But some people say it was because the terms were insufficient and he was willing, but was waiting for slightly better terms. I don't buy that. I don't think so. But other people disagree with me on this.
What do you think?
Well, just briefly in response, Arafat formally recognized Israel in 1993.
Yeah, earlier.
I don't think actually that in 2001 a genuine resolution was on offer, because I think the maximum Israel was prepared to offer, admittedly more than it had been prepared to offer in the past, fell short of the minimum that the Palestinians considered to be a reasonable two-state settlement, bearing in mind that as of 1949, Israel controlled 78% of the British Mandate of Palestine. The Palestinians were seeking a state on the remaining 22%, and this was apparently too much for Israel. My response to your question would be...
Wait, they were being offered something like 22 or 21%.
They were being offered, I think, less than a withdrawal to the 1967 borders with mutual and minor and reciprocal land swaps and the just resolution of
the refugee problem was one of the
questions. Yes. I worked for a number of years with International Crisis Group, and my boss at the time was Rob Malley, who was one of the American officials present at Camp
recently
David.
Thrown out of the State Department or whatever.
The point I want to make about Rob was he wrote, I think, a very perceptive article in 2001 in the New York Review of Books. I know that you and Ehud Barak have had a debate with him, but I think he gives a very compelling reason of why and how Camp David failed. But rather than going into that,
he wrote that together with Hussein Ara.
Hussein Ara, yes, who was not at Camp David.
Yes.
But in response to your question, I think there could have been a real possibility of Israeli-Palestinian and Arab-Israeli peace in the mid-1970s, in the wake of the 1973 October War. Um, uh, I'll recall that in 1971, Moshe Dayan, Israel's defense minister at the time, full of triumphalism about Israel's victory in 1967, speaking to a group of Israeli military veterans, stated, if I had to choose between Sharm el-Sheikh without peace or peace without Sharm el-Sheikh, this is referring to the
Sinai.
resort in Egyptian Sinai, which was then under Israeli occupation, Dayan said, I will choose for Sharm el-Sheikh without peace. Then the 1973 war came along, and I think Israeli calculations began to change very significantly. And I think it was in that context that had there been a joint U.S.-Soviet push for an Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian resolution that incorporated both an Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 lines and the establishment of a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, I think there was a very reasonable prospect for that being achieved. It ended up being aborted, I think, for several reasons, and ultimately, the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat decided, for reasons we can discuss later, to launch a separate unilateral initiative for Israeli-Egyptian rather than Arab-Israeli peace. And I think once that set in motion, the prospects disappeared because Israel essentially saw its most powerful adversary removed from the equation and felt that this would give it a free hand in the occupied territories, also in Lebanon, to get rid of the PLO and so on. So, and you ask, when were we closest? And I can't give you an answer of when we were closest. I can only tell you when I think we could have been close, and that was a lost opportunity. If we look at the situation today, there's been a lot of discussion about a two-state settlement. My own view, and I've written about this, I don't buy the arguments of the naysayers that we have passed the so-called point of no return with respect to a two-state settlement. Certainly, if you look at the Israeli position in the occupied territories, I would argue it's more tenuous than was the French position in Algeria in 1954, than was a British position in Ireland in 1916, than was the Ethiopian position in Eritrea in 1990. And so, as a matter of practicality, as a matter of principle, I do think the establishment of a Palestinian state in the occupied territories remains realistic. I think the question that we now need to ask ourselves, it's one I'm certainly asking myself since October 7th, and looking at Israel's genocidal campaign, but also looking at larger questions. Is it desirable? Can you have peace with what increasingly appears to be an irrational, genocidal state that seeks to confront and resolve each and every political challenge with violence, and that reacts to its failure to achieve solutions to political challenges with violence by applying even more violence, that has an insatiable lust for Palestinian territory, that a genocidal apartheid state that seems increasingly incapable of even conceiving of peaceful coexistence with the other people on that land. So I'm very pessimistic that a solution is possible. I look at, I grew up in Western Europe in the long shadow of the Second World War. I think we can all agree that there could have been no peace in Europe had certain regimes on that continent not been removed from power. I look at Southeast Asia in the late 1970s, and I think we're all agreed that there could not have been peace in that region had the Khmer Rouge not been ousted. I look at Southern Africa during the 1990s, and I think we can all be agreed that had the white minority regimes of that ruled Zimbabwe and South Africa not been dismantled, there could not have been peace in that region. And although I think it's worth having a discussion, I do think it's now a legitimate question to ask, can there be peace without dismantling the Zionist regime? And I make a very clear distinction between the Israeli state and its institutions on the one hand, and the Israeli people, who I think, regardless of our discussion about the history, I think you can now talk about an Israeli people and a people that have developed rights over time, and a formula for peaceful coexistence with them will need to be found, which is a separate matter from dismantling the Israeli state and its institutions. And again, I haven't reached clear conclusions about this, except to say, as a practical matter, I think a two-state settlement remains feasible. But I think there are very legitimate questions about its desirability and about whether peace can be achieved in the Middle East with the persistence of an irrational, genocidal, apartheid regime, particularly because Israeli society is beginning to develop many extremely distasteful, supremacist, dehumanizing aspects that I think also stand in the way of coexistence that are being fed by this regime.
So if you look back into history, when we were closest to peace, and do you draw any hope from any of them?
I feel like in 2000, I feel like the deal that was present, at least at the end of the Taba summit, I think in terms of what Israel, I think, had the appetite to give and what the Palestinians would have gotten, would have definitely been the most agreeable between the two parties. I don't know if in 73, I'm not sure if the appetite would have ever been there for the Arab states to negotiate alongside the Palestinians. I know that in Jordan, there was no love for the Palestinians after, 1970, after Black September. I know that Sadat had no love for the Palestinians due to their association with the Muslim Brotherhoods, attempted assassinations in Egypt.
Sorry, which? PLO and the Muslim Brotherhood?
Sadat was upset because there were attempted assassinations by people an assassination. It was a personal friend of his, Yusuf al-Sibai. I can't pronounce that. He was assassinated in Cyprus by a Palestinian
He was killed by the Abu Nidal organization.
Sure, yeah.
Not part
admittedly,
of the PLO,
he says as much belongs to a splinter group, not the PLO directly, but I think that there was a history of the Palestinians sometimes fighting with their neighboring states that were hosting them if they weren't getting the political concessions they wanted. The assassination of the Jordanian king in 51 might be another example of that in Jordan. It feels like over a long period of time, it feels like the Palestinians have been kind of told from the neighboring Arab states that if they just continue to enact violence, whether in Israel or abroad, that eventually a state will materialize somehow. I don't think it's gotten them any closer to a state. If anything, I think it's taken them farther and farther and farther away from one. And I think as long as the hyperbolic language is continually employed internationally, the idea that Israel is committing a genocide, the idea that there is an apartheid, the idea that they live in a concentration camp, all of these words, I think, further the narrative for the Palestinians that Israel is an evil state that needs to be dismantled. You said as much about the institution, at least, of the Zionist government. Israel's government is probably not going anywhere. All of the other surrounding Arab states have accepted that, or at least countries, most of them down in the Gulf, Egypt and Jordan, have accepted that. The Palestinians need to accept it too. The Israeli state or the state apparatus is not going anywhere. And at some point, they need to realize, like, hey, we need a leader that's going to come out and represent us, represent all of us, is willing to take political risks, is willing to negotiate some lasting peace for us. And it's not going to be the international community or some invocation of international law or some invocation of morality or justice that's going to extricate us from this conflict. It's going to take some actual difficult political maneuvering on the ground
of accepting Israel.
Which
they formally did in 1993.
Which they formally did in 1993. Yeah, but then no lasting peace came after that in 2000.
No, because 1993 was not a peace agreement.
Sure, the Oslo Accords didn't have a final solution.
Were an interim agreement, and Palestinians actually began clamoring for commencing the permanent status resolutions on schedule, and the Israelis kept delaying them. In fact, they only began, I believe, in 99 under American pressure on the Israelis. And
I think you're being a bit one-sided. Both sides didn't fulfill the promise of Oslo and the steps needed for Oslo. There was Palestinian terrorism, which accompanied Israel's expansion of settlements and other things. The two things fed each other and led to what happened in 2000, which was a breakdown of the talks altogether when the Palestinians said no. But I think I don't agree, incidentally, with this definition of Israel or the Israeli state as apartheid. It's not. There is some sort of apartheid going on in the West Bank. The Israeli regime itself is not an apartheid regime. This is nonsense by any definition of apartheid.
By the formal definition, I think it qualifies.
No, it doesn't qualify. Apartheid is a race-based distinction between different segments of the population, and some of them don't have any representation at all, like the blacks in South Africa. No rights at all. In Israel itself, the minority, the Arabs, do have representation, do have rights, and so on. I don't think Israel is also genocidal. I don't think it's been genocidal. It wasn't so in 48. It wasn't so in 67, and it hasn't been recently, in my view. And talk about dismantling Israel, and that's what you're talking about, is, I think Stephen said it correctly, is counterproductive. It just pushes Israelis further away from willing to give Palestinians anything.
Please, Norm, tell me you have
something optimistic to say.
No, even though I agree, I've thought about it a lot, and I agree with Mouin's analysis. I'm not really in the business of punditry. I rather look at the historical record where I feel more comfortable, and I feel on terra firma. So I'd like to just go through that. I agree and I disagree with Mouin on the 73 issue. After the 1973 war, it was clear that Israel was surprised by what happened during the war, and it took a big hit. The estimates are, I don't know what numbers you use, but I hear between 2,000 and 3,000 Israeli soldiers were killed during the 1970s.
It was 2,500?
Yeah, 2,700.
Yeah, okay, so I got it right. Yeah. I read different numbers. That's, it's a very large number of Israelis who were killed. There were moments at the beginning of the war where there was a fear that this might be it.
There wasn't.
No,
this is nonsense. Everybody forgets Israel's atomic weaponry.
I know, but
so how could they have been defeated?
Didn't Diane talk about the collapse of the third temple?
He did, but it was hysterical and silly. Because Israel had atomic weapons, they wanted to stop the Syrians or the Egyptians.
But we're talking about perceptions.
Yeah, I'm not. I can't tell you if he was hysterical or not.
No, he was. For a day, he was
in the same room with him.
For a day, he was
hysterical. But I'm just saying, let's not bog down on that. The war is over, and when President Carter comes into power, Carter was an extremely smart guy, Jimmy Carter, extremely smart guy, and he was very fixed on details. He was probably the most impressive of modern American presidents, in my opinion, by a wide margin. And he was determined to resolve the conflict on a big scale, on the Arab-Israeli scale. On the Palestinian issue, he wouldn't go past what he called a Palestinian homeland. He wouldn't
Palestinian national home.
And the Palestinian national home. He wouldn't go as far as a Palestinian state. I'm not going to go into the details of that. I don't think realistically, given the political balance of forces, that was going to happen, but that's a separate issue. Let's get to the issue at hand, namely, what is the obstacle, or what has been the obstacle since the early 1970s? Since roughly 1974, the Palestinians have accepted the two-state settlement on the June 1967 border. Now, as more pressure was exerted on Israel because the Palestinians seemed reasonable, the Israelis, to quote the Israeli political scientist Avner Yaniv, he since passed from the scene, he said, Yaniv in his book, Dilemmas of Security, he said that the big Israeli fear was what he called the Palestinian peace offensive. That was their worry, that the Palestinians were becoming too moderate. And unless you understand that, you can't understand the June 1982 Lebanon War. The purpose of the June 1982 Lebanon War was to liquidate the PLO in southern Lebanon because they were too moderate, the Palestinian peace offensive. I'm going to have to fast forward. There are many events. There's the First Intifada, then there's the Oslo Accord, and let's now go to the heart of the issue, namely the 2000-2001 negotiations. Well, the negotiations are divided into three parts for the sake of listeners. There's Camp David in July 2000. There are the Clinton parameters in December 2000. And then there are negotiations in Taba in Egypt in 2001. Those are the three phases. Now, I have studied the record probably to the point of insanity because there are so many details you have to master.
I'll vouch for that, the insanity part. Yeah.
I will vouch for it. I will personally vouch for it. There is one extensive record from that whole period from 2000 to, you could say, 2007. And that is what came to be called the Palestine Papers, which are about 15,000 pages of all the records of the negotiations. I have read through all of them, every single page. And this is what I find. If you look at Shlomo Ben Ami's book, which I have with me, Prophets Without Honor, it's his last book. He says, going into Camp David, that means July, going into Camp David, July 2000, he said the Israelis were willing to withdraw from 92% of the West Bank.
Ben Ami was at Camp David.
Yeah, he was at Taba. He was also at Camp David. Israel wanted to keep all the major settlement blocks. It wanted to keep roughly 8% of the West Bank. They were allowing for, you put it at 84 to 90% in your books. They put it at roughly 92%. Israel was willing to give up.
It also depends how you calculate.
Yeah, that was another
depends
issue.
what stage Camp David, because there were 2 weeks.
I'll get to that.
Proposals changed during
So
those 2 weeks.
Israel wants to keep all the major settlement blocks.
Means the border area of the West Bank.
Well, not the border. We have Ariel. We have Ma'ale Adumim. We have, as Condoleezza Rice called Ariel, she said it was a dagger into the heart of the West Bank. So they want to keep 8% of the land. They want to keep the settlement blocks. They want to keep 80% of the settlers. They will not budge an inch on the question of refugees. To quote Ehud Barak in the article he co-authored with you in the New York Review of Books, we will accept, and I think the quote's accurate, no moral, legal, or historical responsibility for what happened to the refugees. So forget about even allowing refugees to return. We accept no moral, legal, or historical responsibility for the refugees. And on Jerusalem, they wanted to keep large parts of Jerusalem. Now, how do we judge who is reasonable and who is not? Ben Ami says, I think the Israeli offer was reasonable. That's how he sees it. But what is the standard of reasonable? My standard is, what does international law say? International law says the settlements are illegal. Israel wants to keep all the settlement blocks. 15 judges, all 15, in the Wall decision in 2004, in July 2004, all 15 judges, including the American judge Bergenthal, ruled the settlements are illegal under international law. They want to keep 80% of the settlers. Under international law, all the settlers are illegal in the West Bank. They want to keep large parts of East Jerusalem. But under international law, East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. That's what the international...
No, not Palestinian, because there was no Palestine.
Okay.
There's never been a Palestinian state. So how could it be Palestinian?
I listened patiently to you.
Sorry.
Under international law, if you read the decision, all territory, the 2004 wall decision, all territory beyond the Green Line, which includes East Jerusalem, is occupied Palestinian territory.
The exception of the Golan Heights.
The designated unit, according to the International Court of Justice, the designated unit for Palestinian self-determination. And they deny any right whatsoever on the right of return. The maximum, I don't want to go into the details now, the maximum formal offer was by Ehud Olmert in 2008. He offered 5,000 refugees could return under what was called family reunification, 5,000 in the course of 5 years, and no recognition of any Israeli responsibility. So, if you use as the baseline what the UN General Assembly has said and what the International Court of Justice has said, if you use that baseline, international law, by that baseline, all the concessions came from the Palestinian side. Every single concession came from the Palestinian side. None came from the Israeli side. They may have accepted less than what they wanted, but it was still beyond what international law allocated to them. Now, you say...
Allocated to the Palestinians.
Allocated to Palestinians, yes. Thank you for the clarification. Now, about Arafat. Liked the Mufti, never liked the guy. I think that was one of the only disagreements Mouin and I had when Arafat passed. You were a little sentimental, I was not. Never liked the guy. But politics, you don't have to like the guy. There was no question, nobody argues it, that whenever the negotiations started up, the Palestinians just kept saying the same things.
No.
No.
They kept saying no.
No. Professor Morris, with due respect, incorrect. They kept saying international legitimacy, international law, UN resolutions. They said, we already gave you what the law required. We gave that in 1988, November 1988, and then ratified again at Oslo in 1993. And they said, now we want what was promised us under international law. And that was the one point where everybody on the other side agreed. Clinton, don't talk to me about international law. Livni, during the Olmert administration, she said, I studied international law. I don't believe in international law. Every single member on the other side, they didn't want to hear from international law. And to my thinking, that is the only reasonable baseline for trying to resolve the conflict. and Israel has, along with the U.S.
When has international law been relevant to any conflict in the world?
Hey, that's why
over the last 150
That's why the
years.
Palestinians had to recognize Israel, because that's international law.
No, but international law is meaningless.
That was UN Resolution
conflicts are not
242.
solved by international law or in accordance with international law.
But then, Professor Morris, for argument's sake, let's agree on that. Strictly for argument's sake. What's the alternative? Dennis Ross said, we're going to decide who gets what on the basis of needs. So he says, Israel needs this, Israel needs that, Israel needs that. Dennis Ross decided to be the philosopher king. He's going to decide on the basis of needs. Well, if you asked me, since Gaza is one of the densest places on earth, it needs a good chunk. Yes, it
needs part of Sinai.
It needs a nice big chunk
of Sinai.
Well, not Sinai.
That's what it actually needs.
Okay, I don't even want to go there. It needs a nice big chunk, but I have to accept international law says no. Okay,
international law is irrelevant.
Now Ben Ami says, I think the Israeli offer was reasonable. Okay, that's
he's a reasonable guy.
He seems it, even though. Okay, I don't want to go there. I've debated him, and partly agree with you. But who decides what's reasonable? I think the international community, in its political incarnation, the General Assembly, the Security Council, all those UN Security Council resolutions saying the settlements are illegal, annexation of East Jerusalem is null and void, and the International Court of Justice. That, to me, is a reasonable standard. And by that standard, the Palestinians were asked to make concessions, which I consider unreasonable, or the international community considers unreasonable.
I think that the issue is when you apply international law or international standards, I wouldn't say what Benny Morris says, that they're irrelevant, but I think that these have to be seen as informing the conversation. I don't think these are the final shape of the conversation. I don't think historically Israel has ever negotiated within the strict bounds of whether we're talking Resolution 242, whether we're talking about any General Assembly resolutions. That's just not how these negotiations tend to go. You might consider international opinion on things, but at the end of the day, it's the bilateral negotiations, oftentimes historically started in secret, independent of the international community, that end up shaping what the final agreements look like. I think the issue with this broad appeal to international law is, again, going back to my earlier point about all of the euphemistic words, all it simply does is drive Palestinian expectations up to a level that is never going to be satisfied. For instance, you can throw that ICJ opinion all you want. It was an advisory opinion. That came in 2004. Have Palestinians gained more or less land since that 2004 advisory opinion was issued?
So what would your standard be then?
Both sides have to have a delegation that confronts each other, and they assess the realistic conditions on the ground, and they try to figure out within the confines of international law, and within what both sides are reasonable for. But like, for instance, this statement of like full retreat from the West Bank, what is it, 400,000 settlers? How many settlers live in the West Bank now?
Probably 500,000.
Yeah, you're going to...
Depends if you include the Jerusalem suburbs or not.
400,000 or 500,000 people are never...
With the Jerusalem suburbs, perhaps.
Yeah.
But Israel calls
half a million people
Jerusalem, not settlements.
I know that, but that's not what the law calls it null and void.
We can say whatever we want until we're blue in the face, but like there's 500,000 Israeli people are not being expelled from the West.
My
It's not going to
response,
happen.
you're basically saying, if I understand correctly, there's only one way to resolve this, and that is through direct bilateral negotiation.
Probably, yeah.
Okay. So,
or ideally, but
I've taken over your house. Okay. You're not going to go to the police because, the law is only of limited value. So you come over and sit in what is now my living room that used to be your living room, and we negotiate. The problem there is that you're not going to get anything unless I agree to it. And standards and norms and law and all the rest of it be damned. So you need to take into account that when you're advocating bilateral negotiations, that effectively that gives each of the parties veto power. And in the current circumstances, the Palestinians have already recognized Israel. They have.
Wait, what? You keep bringing that up like it's a significant concession,
true. It's not
and
true.
And even if
it's not even true.
It doesn't. But it doesn't. The recognition from Palestine isn't. doing anything for.
You're
Hamas totally rejects.
I'm not talking about Hamas.
Hamas is the majority among the Palestinian people. They won the elections in 2006.
They won a majority of the seats.
Yes, exactly.
They didn't win a majority of the votes.
Every opinion poll today says the majority of Palestinians
that sounds
support
right.
the Hamas.
That sounds
and the Hamas absolutely rejects Israel.
But
so if Arafat in 2003, 1993 or whatever issued a sort of recognition,
it wasn't
of Israel,
a sort of recognition.
Okay, a recognition of Israel. It's meaningless. It's meaningless.
It's meaningless.
And anyhow, I don't believe that Arafat was sincere about it.
Does it matter what you or I think
well,
about
most
what
Israelis
you felt?
do, and that does matter.
Okay,
That does matter. But Hamas says no, and Hamas is the majority today.
So for years, for years, the Israeli and U.S. demand was that the Palestinians recognize 242 and 338. They did, but you're saying, okay, we demanded that they do this, but it was meaningless when they did it. Then the demand was that
a tactical thing. Yes.
Then the demand was the PLO recognize Israel.
Tactical.
Okay, we demanded that they did this, and they did it, but it's meaningless.
And they never changed their charter, the PLO. You may remember that.
In fact,
they supposedly abrogated the old charter, but never came up with a new one.
No,
so there was no new charter.
But in 1996,
and Farouk Kaddoumi said, of course, the old charter is still in force.
Yes. But the point is, the Palestinians' demands are constantly made of them, and when they accede to those demands, they're then told, actually, what you did is meaningless. So here's a new set of demands. I mean, it's like a hamster.
There's no new set of demands.
It's like a hamster. Let me tell you what.
Let me tell you what.
That will be told, if you run fast enough, you'll get out of the cage.
No. The bottom line is that Israel would like a Palestinian Sadat. It wants the Palestinians. Listen.
This
just
is
let me
really
finish.
a worst case scenario.
Okay, let me just because they shot Sadat. But anyhow, the Israelis want
for good reason.
Want the Palestinians. Israelis want the Palestinians to actually accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel and the Zionist project, and then live side by side with them in two states. That's what the Israelis. I don't even know if it's true. I don't even know if that's true today.
And what is the formal position of this Israeli government?
No, I'm saying I don't know if it exists.
Okay,
today,
its predecessor and its predecessor. Come on.
That's what Israelis want. They want a change of psyche among the Palestinians. And if that doesn't happen, there won't be a Palestinian state.
Mouin has an interesting point.
Forget international law.
I know you want to forget it, just like you want to forget the genocide charge. But I know you want to forget that.
Well, the Palestinians want to forget it too when it doesn't suit them as well, right?
But here's the problem, and it's exactly the problem that Mouin just brought up. Now, I read carefully your book, One State, Two States. With all due respect, absolutely a disgrace. Coming from you.
Most reviewers didn't agree with you, though.
Yeah, coming from you was like you wrote it in your sleep. It's nothing compared to what you wrote before. I don't know why you did it. In my opinion, you ruined your reputation. Not totally, but you undermined it with that book. But let's get to the issue that Mouin wrote. Here's what you said. You said, formally, yes, it's true. The Palestinians recognize Israel. But then you said, viscerally, in their hearts, they didn't really recognize Israel. So I thought to myself, how does Professor Morris know what's in the hearts of Palestinians? I don't know. I was surprised as a historian you would be talking about what's lurking in the hearts of Palestinians. But then you said something which was really interesting. You said, even if in their hearts they accepted Israel, you said, quote, rationally, they could never accept Israel because they got nothing. They had this beautiful Palestine, and now they're reduced to just a few parcels of land.
So they will never accept it.
So, yes. So you said there's no way they can accept it.
No, I would say that as well.
Yeah.
The two-state solution, as proposed, doesn't make any sense.
Exactly as Mouin said, you keep moving the goalposts
no.
until we reach the point where we realize, according to Benny Morris, there can't be a solution. So why don't you just say that outright? Why don't you say it outright? That according to you, the Palestinians can never be reasonable because according to you,
they want all of Palestine.
According
That's
to you,
why.
they couldn't possibly agree to a two-state settlement because it's such a lousy settlement.
Because
That's
they
what
want
you
all
say.
of Palestine.
But you said rationally they couldn't accept it, not their feelings.
It's both.
You said rational. You went from formally, viscerally, rationally. So now we're reaching the point where, according to Benny Morris, the Palestinians can't be reasonable because reasonably they have to reject two states.
They want all of
Mouin is
Palestine.
absolutely correct. There's no way to resolve the problem
They
according to
want
your
all of
logic.
Palestine. He said that himself. He said they should dismantle Israel. That's what he's saying.
What I said.
He didn't say that.
Dismantle Israel.
What I said, and I've written.
I'm glad you didn't deny it.
I've written extensively on this issue on why a two-state settlement is still feasible, and I came out in support of that proposition. Perhaps in my heart, you can see that I was just bullshitting, but that's what I actually wrote. That was a number of years ago, and just as a matter of historical record, beginning in the early 1970s, there was fierce debate within the Palestinian national movement about whether to accept or reject. And there were three schools of thought. There was one that would accept nothing less than the total liberation of Palestine. There was a second that accepted what was called the establishment of a fighting national authority on Palestinian soil, which they saw as a springboard for the total liberation of Palestine. And there was a third school that believed that under current dynamics and so on, that they should go for a two-state settlement. And our friend and correspondent, Kauter Loerse, has written a very perceptive article on when the PLO, already in 1976, came out in open support of a two-state resolution at the Security Council. PLO accepted it. Israel, of course, rejected it. But the resolution didn't pass because the U.S. and the U.K. vetoed it. It was both of them.
I think it was 9-5.
Okay. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that the PLO came to accept a two-state settlement. Why they did it, I think, is irrelevant. And subsequently, the PLO acted on the basis of seeking to achieve a two-state settlement. The reason, I think, and I think, Norm, you've written about this, the reason that Arafat was so insistent on getting the minimally acceptable terms for a two-state settlement at Camp David and afterwards was precisely because he knew that once he signed, that was all the Palestinians were going to get. If his intention had been, I'm not accepting Israel, I simply want a springboard, he would have accepted a Palestinian state in Jericho. But he didn't. He insisted.
That's something I've never understood. He should have logically accepted the springboard and then from there launched his next stage.
You don't understand.
He should have done that.
International law would put a real constraint on him.
No, but also
once he accepted, it was over.
Constitutionally, he was incapable of signing.
Well,
I don't know that.
If that's,
you're right that he should have accepted it.
But if you're correct, okay, that he was really out to eliminate Israel, then he wouldn't have cared about the borders. He wouldn't have cared about what the thing said about refugees. He would have gotten a sovereign state and used that to achieve that purpose. But I think it was precisely because he recognized that he was not negotiating for a springboard. He was negotiating permanent status, that he was such a stickler about the details. The second,
as a factual matter, he wasn't such a stickler. When they asked him how many refugees, the numbers.
It was a principle rather than the numbers.
Principle.
He said I would be pragmatic about it.
Yes, and the numbers that were used at Annapolis were between 100 and 250,000 refugees over 10 years. That was the number. Arafat, when he was asked at Camp David, he kept saying, I care about the Lebanese, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, which came to about 300,000. Which was a large concession from whether you accept the number or not. That he wasn't talking about 6 million. He was talking about between 100 and 250,000 over 10 years. Now, the best offer that came from the Palestinians, the best offer that came from Israel was the Olmert offer.